telecom bill, which has finally paved way for what could be the satellite allocation. So satellite internet coming to your home soon, but no room for really WhatsApp and Signal.
So that's exactly the confusion right now and the ambiguity of the new telecom bill introduced by Ashwini Vaishnav in Parliament yesterday in Lok Sabha. Now, interestingly, 2-3 areas really surface for discussion here. Number one, it has been presented and it has been tabled as a finance bill or a money bill, which means that it's going to pass without a discussion in Rajya Sabha.
So no discussion at all.
So there's no room for discussion. Number two, like you mentioned, all the OTT apps, and by OTT I'm not referring to the OTT streaming entertainment apps, but OTT internet-based communication apps. These include your WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, Zoom, Skype. All of these have been left out of the ambit. In fact, when you read through the 46-page draft, the mention of internet is just once in an internet protocol context, but the broad definition of telecommunication has been kept fairly wide. Now, right now, it's open to interpretation whether OTT apps like the ones that I mentioned, which are these communication apps, would they largely be defined as telecommunications? Because at one end of the spectrum, while they are not really using the airwaves of telecommunication as we know, they are still used for the same purpose. They meet the same end requirement of a user.
Which is to communicate.
Which is to communicate. And this communication can be done through audio, just like you do in the case of a regular telephone call. But that definition is still fairly broad. Now, the assumption right now is that in case these OTT internet-based apps are kept out of the ambit of the telecom bill, these could make their way into the Digital India Act when that gets tabled and that gets passed and becomes an act. And that is unlikely to happen in this session of the Parliament. In fact, it is not slated for the winter session at all. So this is the second point. The third point really is, like you mentioned, the allocation of spectrum. And allocation of spectrum in India has been a challenge, has been a problem area, and has been rife with charges of corruption. Now, the allocation of spectrum in the case of satellite-driven internet or satellite broadband is going to be done using the administrative route, which means the auction of spectrum, which gave TRAI a lot of powers, will now pave way for the government using the administrative route to allocate spectrum. Now, this obviously is good news at one end for the likes of Jio Space Fiber, as well as Airtel's Starlink also, right? So Airtel's OneWeb, and then making way for Elon Musk's Starlink to also come into India without going through that whole auction process and multiple rounds of bidding, etc., for allocation of spectrum. What the telecom bill, in addition to this, Shweta, is also doing is that it is reducing the powers vested with TRAI, the regulator, and giving more power to the government. So in case of an emergency.
Absolutely, which is where I want to, perhaps talk about some of the concerns with the bill, and a lot of activists over the past 24 hours have raised those concerns on social media as to what sort of power it gives to the government when it comes to suspension of internet and telecommunication activities. I think that remains a cause of concern.
Right. So internet, we don't know. Like I mentioned, the bill mentions the word internet in the context of internet protocol just once. So, the broader definition of what the government can seize control of is still unclear when it comes to internet services. However, telecommunication services, and this means either taking over an entire telecom network, or perhaps, a group of users or any individual for that matter, or a geographical area, the government will now have complete power. I mean, it's not that the government did not exercise that power in the past, but now...
But that wasn't in the bill.
It wasn't in the bill. So now, as a matter of legislature, as a matter of law, if the bill does get passed and in some time become an act,
which it will,
then which it will, because it's not going to entail a discussion in the Rajya Sabha. So it gives government that sort of, absolute power to control telecommunication services. And like I mentioned, telecommunication services is in itself a very, very broad area which hasn't been clearly defined in the bill.
I think one of the concerns, perhaps, I think for the benefit of our viewers also needs to be highlighted is that by the way of government's absolute majority in Lok Sabha, the bill would have anyway been passed. But by passing it through the money bill route, you're essentially preventing any sort of discussion on the bill in the Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha, which is a point of concern where the opposition parties will not be able to perhaps relay some of our concerns with respect to the bills.
I mean, see, we are in any case looking at a situation where 78 MPs have been suspended. So what what room for discussion is there in any case in Parliament right now? So 78 MPs have been, they've been removed, they've been sort of moved away from Parliament. And in addition to that, no discussion in Rajya Sabha. So you're right, this bill is going to get passed in all likelihood and is going to soon become an act. But I think the broad areas right now still remain around how do you define telecommunications? So is telecommunication only restricted to the telecom services that you opt for by way of who the service provider is and the regular phone calls that we make, for which the telecom infrastructure comes into play, as opposed to internet-driven communication? So I think that is the broad area of ambiguity and confusion right now. But I think it has to again be looked into, in the light of the Digital India Bill, which has also been pending for a while, and hopefully in the next session of Parliament, that is something that all eyes would be on.
Absolutely.
And that would give, instead of TRAI, the power to regulate, or the Telecom Authority, Department of Telecom, to sort of monitor and regulate telecommunications, MeitY would come into picture. So it would be the Ministry of IT and Electronics, which will perhaps form a similar or, a slightly wider definition and a wider bill when you look at these OTT apps like WhatsApp and Signal.
All right, but so far, no regulation in order by the way of the new telecom bill. That is what we know of. There remains ambiguity as to who will govern and whether there will be a regulation when it comes to your OTT telecommunication apps like WhatsApp as well as Signal.